Well, foreign direct investment into Africa has increased significantly over the last decade, and although perceptions of higher risks in Africa still linger, strong growth from emerging economies in Asia and the Middle East, a resurgence in investment from developed markets, and strong growth in intra-African investment shows that Africa is poised to enter the Premier League of investment destinations within the next decade. Joining us for more is Ajen Sita. He is CEO of Ernst & Young Africa. Thanks so much, Ajen, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's go through it, because it sounds all poetic, you know, what I've just read there. But what kind of foreign direct interest are we seeing right now? What growth rate are we witnessing?
Well, you're right, and the point around it being poetic, I think, is also worth qualifying and saying there's actual investment that follows all the poetry that people are talking about. So over the last decade, if we look at combined GDP across the African continent, our GDP has more than tripled. So there's actually real money flowing with all of what might seem as hype. So we're really strong believers in the overall growth. When your question around where is it all going, it differs by country. Clearly, with our diverse group of countries across Africa, many of the West African countries are experiencing investment in oil and gas sectors, the heavy resource-based sectors. There's no doubt that, by contrast, though, in South Africa, which is a far more developed economy on a relative basis, we're experiencing more diversified spread of that investment into financial services, telecoms, even renewable energy has been a big growth area in this past year.
Ajen, it's Lindsay in Cape Town. We've just had some gentlemen in that are starting up a big fast food business, an American brand. It's called Burger King. It's coming in. I don't know if that constitutes foreign direct investment. But what came out from the president of Burger King was that he said that he thought this market was underserviced. And if you look at the rest of Africa, and I'm not just talking about fast food, but as you mentioned, financial services, telecommunications, is that the case as well? Is this the tip of the iceberg, is what I'm really saying?
Well, Burger King follows investments that you've seen in the past 18 months from the likes of Walmart acquiring the Massmart business. We know that Coca-Cola has announced big plans for its further expansion of its already large business across the African continent. There's no doubt that with our large population base across the continent and the significant growth of a middle class, so the expectations is come 2020, Africa will have a middle class that is actually rivals that of India and China. So there's no doubt that that is a market that is underserved today, which is a ready opportunity for large consumer goods businesses or retail businesses who are operating in mature markets of the world where there isn't much GDP growth at all.
Where there's this heightened investment interest coming through to Africa, where do we in South Africa stand? I mean, are we losing our appeal as a gateway to Africa and that status? Because it's certainly a status that seems to be fading, especially where you've got regional blocks coming to the fore, like the East African community specifically, because what that brings to the table is a market that does now provide the kind of scale that was the appeal of South Africa.
There's no doubt that other African countries are growing in relative importance or significance or attraction for foreign investors. But I think the narrative that says South Africa is losing its gateway status is actually not fact-based. If you wanted to actually look at the real flow of FDI, then over the last 5 years, South Africa has actually been the single largest recipient of foreign direct investment when you look at sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, more interestingly, it is the largest African investor onto the rest of the continent, and in fact is sixth largest overall. What you are seeing, though, is a change in the character of investment. So when you look at South Africa, given the fact that today more than 65% of the economy is actually a services-based economy, we're seeing smaller amounts of capital into larger numbers of projects that reflect the diversified nature of our economy. Whereas if you compare it to the large economies, and often comparisons done with Nigeria or Angola, over 80% of FDI into those countries actually go into one sector, which is in oil and gas. So you're not seeing much diversification. So we don't hold that belief that South Africa is losing its gateway status. In fact, the facts show quite the contrary. It is by far the leader in the African continent, and by big margins.
Ajen, what about the attitude of investors? The Afro-optimism is now very much a theme, and we talk about it a lot on CNBC Africa. But are there still people out there who, when you introduce the idea of Africa to them, they say, well, goodness me, it's a little bit daunting for me because of the different countries, because of the different regulations, all the different jurisdictions having different rules here and there. Is that still a factor that holds some people back?
I think it is. There's no doubt that the large size of the geography we're talking about, 54 countries, very diverse language, regulatory environments, trade structures, etc. What we're finding, though, is that what's keeping people back is a lack of proper research-based understanding of the individual markets. And we think that African governments can do a better job of talking about the investment proposition and recognizing that they're actually competing for foreign direct investment. So I think more needs to be done to tell the factual story of the opportunity across Africa today than is being done.